Hello there, what is up? My name is the Buttery Gamer, and today I'm joined by a few members of the Hand of Unity Discord gaming community focused in Ashes of Creation and WoW Classic. And today we're going to be talking about Ashes of Creation and the node system. Today I'm joined by Neris. Neris, could you introduce yourself, who you are and what your role is within the Hand of Unity? Why and how long have you been interested in Ashes of Creation? What tier of package that have you got for Ashes? And what is it that first attracted you to Ashes of Creation?
Okay, so personally, I am one of the co-leaders here at Hand of Unity, responsible for PvE content and community management. I'm a long-term gamer myself, started back in Ultima Online, enjoy healers, breeding, dungeons, and guilds, in all honesty. I've been interested in Ashes of Creation ever since the Kickstarter began, several years ago now, what feels like several years. And since then, I would say, dabbled initially with interest in the project. And as we've gotten further along in development and I've seen what Intrepid have produced, I've become more and more interested in it, more and more invested. And here we are today. In terms of package, I currently have the Braver of Worlds Kickstarter package, and which I believe gives me, off the top of my head, all for one access to the game as well as a lifetime subscription. The thing that really, I would say, attracted me to Ashes of Creation would be Stephen himself. He was somebody that I played Arcade with fairly extensively during the alpha phases, and really felt the guy was passionate about gaming and had no idea at the time that he was a multi-millionaire and would go on to make such an ambitious project. Besides that, also very interested in the node system, healing, and also the breeding systems within the game.
Next up, Galef, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Galet. I'm a member of Hands of Unity, just a pleb member, no special responsibilities yet. I've been interested in the game ever since I heard of its existence back in the ancient year of 2016, so quite a while now. I got the Braver of World package, and to be honest, I wasn't looking for something specific game feature related when I was looking for a new MMORPG. It was basically that me and a friend were looking for something new after burning out on yet another failed Asian MMORPG. So we were looking for something made in the West, and we found like a link to the unofficial Ashes Discord on like a niche forum back when it was owned by Dead Proxy. And there we came into contact with Stephen, who was really, really active on the Discord. So there was a lot of personal talk between us and Stephen. And later on, yeah, just like Nero said, we found out he was a millionaire and he wanted to pour his heart and his money into a new MMORPG. And basically, it's all connected, like things we were looking for and the thing that Steven wanted. So we decided to back the project. And sadly, my friend isn't here anymore. But, well, he's not dead, but he gave up on MMORPGs after Bless Online. So I
It's
just,
rough.
yeah, it's a rough world, especially for the MMORPG genre, especially for all the failed Asian MMORPGs. But I got good faith in this game, and the community of the Hands of Unity is very supportive
All right, yeah,
for the
that's awesome,
MMORPG
man.
genre.
Next
So,
up, Wolo, if you could introduce yourself.
Okay, I'm Wololo, the Wololo from Age of Empire. So I've been playing MMO since a very long time, since a young age. It starts, I think it was my first MMO, RuneScape, and it just launched when it looked like more of a 2D. And I joined Hand of Unity about 1 year ago, um, almost 1 year ago, about 11 months. And I got interested in Ashes of Creation about 2 years ago. So I've been playing low for about a year, only watching the live streams. And then I quitted my old game, which was Perfect World. Been playing it a long time, top rank PvP. And so I had nothing to do. So I literally typed on YouTube, upcoming best MMORPG, and found this one. So yeah.
Awesome, thanks for that. Next up, Herdo, introduce yourself, my friend.
Hello there, my name is Herdo. I'm an officer in Hand of Unity. I started playing together with Naris a few years ago in Arc Age. That's when I met him. And I learned about Ashes of Creation early 2017, I think February, from a friend. And a little bit later, I got notified by Naris about, hey, do you want to join us for Ashes of Creation? So here I am for that. In the guild, my role is being the quartermaster for Ashes of Creation, as well as being a chapter leader for crafting. Excuse me. Think back in 2017, I sucked up every little bit of content that they pushed out until the Kickstarter campaign started. And I think I followed every live stream in May 2017. After which I ended up buying the Brave of the Worlds package, but it wasn't enough for a few months, so I upgraded to Leader of Man a few months later. And what really got me hooked with Ashes of Creation was the combination of classic MMORPG elements like the Holy Trinity, but also the combination of new sandbox-like elements like the node system with constantly changing contents. And I think this node system will be very refreshing for all of us with delivering dynamic content to us, like constantly changing PvE content and creating new PvP content depending on who we like and who we don't like. And yeah, that's about it for me.
So you mentioned nodes, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So without focusing on the specifics of the nodes, let's talk about the idea of nodes. Do you guys think the idea of a node type system where there's some sort of systems like this in current games, prime example Black Desert Online, where they have workers and node systems for the workers, do you think this node system will add something new and fresh to the MMO genre?
Well, I think it's something fresh, but it's not something entirely new. Like some games kind of tried it, but not in this format. This is like an endless supply of content almost. I think it's really refreshing.
I mean, I think for me personally, I think it has the potential to be something new and something fresh, but it is also, something that has been promised in the past. So, for example, in Guild Wars 2, they did promise the Heart Quest to be something, very dynamic, very world changing, whereas in the end, it really, just turned out to be a glorified quest. But I do believe that Steven's putting a lot of faith and a lot of time into the actual nodes themselves. So I think it will keep things interesting, which will be great.
I like how it makes old zones not useless anymore after a period of time. Like most games struggle with new content, like World of Warcraft, for example, has to release expansions with new zones to keep people interested. But the node system is a system that Intrepid can easily add content to without having to create a whole new world to keep people interested. Which is good because I dislike MMORPGs with dead zones because it just breaks the immersion for me.
Yeah. But I think what you said with Black Desert and the nodes, I think it's a little bit different. I think the nodes in Ashes of Creation will be more like the castles you could build in Black Desert, where you, PvP wise, so you attack and defend your castle.
Yeah, I think it will be nice because I've noticed personally a recent trend in MMOs where, although you form guilds and communities, you guys only tend to meet up for, say, certain events or to do raids or to do dungeons and things like that. Whereas in Ashes, I think it's going to be really nice to have, a focal point for the guild where you can all, work towards something and you have like a unified goal, which I think is really going to really promote that social aspect of things, which is great.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that you mentioned before about Guild Wars 2 as well is that the way this system kind of makes good use of space as well. Like you will have noobs and advanced players running together at the same place because it changes all the time. So I think that's a really good thing.
So here's a question more on the nose. Do you think the nose system itself is too ambitious of a project to deliver? We've already had a few comments from the devs where their timescale has been pushed back for the delivery of the game because they're trying to make this node system, among other things, what they envisioned.
No, it's not too ambitious. They might not release it in the scale they've set it be at launch, but it's a system where they can easily add more content to over time. So it'll get to the point where it will be like they promised.
I
Like,
personally, sorry, go left after you.
Oh, no, I just want to say it's just basically a glorified settler builder. So they can add content easily over time. I don't have any reasons to doubt their ability to pull it off.
I personally, I do believe, like Garliv said, they will deliver, but I must admit I'm a little bit hesitant when it comes to the sheer number of variables that they're trying to attempt. So, randomized layouts, race-specific architecture, and things like that. So, I do worry, given the issue that kind of in that procedural generation creates in games like Minecraft, for example. I do think that's going to be a big issue for them in terms of tackling any bugs and ensuring that those layouts are constantly generated, because there's a lot of different variables and a lot of assets to create.
Yeah, you have a lot of different variables, as you mentioned, the race, the node level, the node type, and then the location, because obviously a node on an island can't look the same as a node on a mountainside. So they got to have a huge pool of like these node templates almost to randomize out of, for it to feel still unique after months or even years of play.
Yeah, I think it's a really big goal they have set for themselves. If I remember correctly, they said at one point that they're gonna have about 100 nodes or a little bit more in the final game.
103 node locations at launch, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that's a huge number, and I just cannot imagine how much time they must spend on each node to make it perfect in every stage it could exist in. We got I think 6 stages a node can be in, and you got to pick about that race and this location in the mountain, and when it's a metropolis, it's gonna be looking like this. And I think it's a lot of work time going into that. But if they can pull this off, I'm really stunned about that achievement they do there.
It's really exciting.
They certainly have the enthusiasm, which definitely helps.
Yeah, for sure. So you mentioned some specifics on those, like Metropolis. So what we have got currently is the different types of nodes. They've released what those are. So this sort of goes on to the thoughts and predictions for those nodes and sort of the metagame. These nodes are the scientific, which has been identified as Artesian and construction focuses. And when that gets up to Metropolis level, I think it's been said that you can get faster travel between nodes. Then there's the military node, which is combat and class. Economic node, which is trade and merchants, which has a linked economy at later stages, and the divine nodes, which we haven't really got anything on, which is skill and equipment focuses. So focusing on the metagame, my personal thoughts are, as my goal is to get the first legendary bow on our server, is that these types of Metropolis nodes or endgame nodes are going to all link in together in terms of the scientific being the Artesian and the construction focus. If you want to get the crafting recipe for that legendary item, I feel you'll need the scientific and the research over like the military, the divine, and the economic nodes. What are your guys' thoughts on these different types of nodes, and then your predictions for the metagame? The last thing I want to mention personally is the economic node, where it's a linked economy. It's a bit different in terms of you have to have two. I think it's two metropolises linked, and they have a linked economy. Where if you look in other games like World of Warcraft, they just have a server-wide linked auction house. In Ashes of Creation, they are putting it forward that you need to have two high-level nodes to have this linked economy.
Right, like you can have maximum 2 metropolises linked or something, and one metropolis covers 1/5 of the world. So that's 2/5 of the world where you can teleport in between if you max out those two That's huge. But that ties nicely into metagaming, like you mentioned before, because you can have like 5 metropolises and there are 4 node types. So if you look at every node type, it seems to connect really good to a specific kind of group. Like the PvPers probably want like a military metropolis, and the crafters, what was it? And
Scientific,
scientific,
economic, and divine nodes are the other
yeah.
three.
So you end up with 4 metropolises, and the 5th one will determine a lot for that specific group. So what I think is that those groups, beside from wars between guilds and all of that, will play their own battle in which the 5th one will be. Because I don't think it will be really common to see that we will lack one of these metropolises. I think we will have one of them at all times, at least. At least that is my opinion. That's what I expect. But I don't know. What's your guys' thoughts on that?
Well, I think you're right, except you will have people who don't like that node being a metropolis and going to constantly attack it whenever they can. So we will have a constant flow about, yeah, this metropolis will disappear and another one will rise somewhere else. Or maybe the same one will rise again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think coming back to the Metropolis point about how we'll probably have a different type. I should imagine that it will probably end up that way, but initially, I reckon there could be a couple of duplicates, and I think that will probably spur some PvP and spur some change in the server itself, which I suppose isn't such a bad thing. I'm definitely more interested to see whether it is, an absolute necessity to, say have a scientific node, a military node, an economic and a divine node, all at Metropolis level, in order to really, kind of, I would say, progress your gear and progress in the game, or whether it's kind of, a nice optional extra on top.
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
I'm curious to see that too. If it's really needed to have this metropolis or not.
I mean, further on that, like, it takes, from what I've looked in node advancement, right, it takes quite a lot of time to advance these nodes. In terms of advancements, it's how many people are operating in that node's area of influence, doing quests, raids, dungeons, is what contributes to the growth of that node. And one of the things, other than PvP, to de-rank that node essentially, and we've talked about this a bit privately, is node atrophy, and how if there's not many people operating in that node's influence, it can potentially reduce the level of that node. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth between nodes depending on how many players are playing on the server. What are your guys' opinions on the current suggestions for node advancement within the game, or what they're going to do?
I personally think it's going to be useful for having a longer time that it takes to kind of hit the those higher levels of the nodes itself, because otherwise the game's going to get fairly dull fairly quickly because people need something to work towards. I do hope that when it comes to sieging nodes, it really does take, the equivalent effort to siege something that it does to basically build it all the way up to, say, level 6 Metropolis stage. I know Steven's stated it in the past, and it's, really something I hope they stick to, because it's going to be, quite a kind of kick for some people if they've invested, say, 6 weeks in a node, and then all of a sudden somebody can just literally take it down within a few hours.
Any of you other guys have any opinions about node advancement?
Well, yeah, I think the node advancement and also the node atrophy, these things has to be balanced really good, right, for it to be competitive. So they mentioned before, I think it was in some 2017 stream, that they are able to adjust certain parameters in like the game based on how many people are on that server. Because obviously, if you have a server that has 2,000 people, it's going to behave different than a server of 12,000 people, right? So my guess is that they're trying to balance it just on the edge, right? So that every node and every citizen really has to work towards, keeping their node alive and keeping it progressing.
Well, you also have to keep in mind that a node never changes its type. So if you start a node and it goes to like town stage, you'll have people who don't want that specific node and spread out again. I think in the early stages, it's going to be a pain to level a node because people don't really know what kind of node they want. And it's not like a level 3 scientific node can become economic node. It will always remain that type of node.
So it will be really diverse. For example, if you have let's say a Metropolis Divine node, and really close to that is a Metropolis or a Divine camp, then probably not many people are willing to like invest time in leveling that camp. I mean, we'll have to see how that turns out, but there's a lot of variation in it.
Yeah, and
No, go ahead, Neris.
I was just going to say, I do see a lot of potential for kind of servers and, kind of guild owners and leaders getting together and discussing kind of plans and, how they should develop particular areas or develop particular nodes. And I think it really does add that political dimension that, games like EVE Online have always had, but we haven't been so fortunate to have in most fantasy MMOs, apart from Arcade and a bit of Black Desert.
Yeah, there are so many possibilities. Like you mentioned, people discussing as strategies to level a certain node. Because if one node gets sieged, then it's a race for the other node to level up, right? Before they get enslaved by someone that levels.
I mean, this comes down to like, and I haven't been able to find this, and it comes down to how do the quests, the raids, the dungeons, everything in that zone of influence of the area determine the specific type of node that it was going to be. Do you guys have any information on that? Is there anything about that?
Well, the node type itself is static, but I think what's slightly overrated is the content that it produces. Because they said like, okay, a boss in a dungeon or a raid boss can have different attacks, and if at a different state, it might add like a fiery attack instead of a sweep attack. But in the end, you can only make so much variations with this, because the more you divide this content, the less content it becomes to play as well. But it's interesting how that turns out. If it will be like, okay, if you have, let's say, a militaristic node, you can always get this certain boss, or does the boss depend on the environment, and does it only spawns with a militaristic node, or else it's a different boss? Or there's not too much information on it. That's true.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe if you level the same node up again to the same level when it de-leveled once, you might get the same boss again, but I don't know if you will get the crafting materials, for example, like the unique weapon materials, etc. But it might be the same boss, might be a different boss. But if it's a different boss every time, they have to have a big pipeline about 10, 15 bosses, for example, for each node level.
Yeah, right. And I can see, like, as you said, different drops, different locations, different attacks. I don't know what else can be different about the boss, but
I think one thing they did change with the actual how they decided the node type. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, originally Stephen wanted to have it random. So, for example, the node types in the locations to a degree would be kind of randomized and different from alpha to beta. But I believe now they're sticking to a static type of node map essentially, but there is slight variation in the positioning of it. So, that is a fairly big change, which may make it a little bit easier to plan, which will be quite nice.
yeah, that was really early. Yeah.
Yeah,
Basically, this. Sorry.
And now it's all the same node types on the same locations across all servers. So it will be the same if you go from server A to B, but the development will be different on each server, depending on the population.
So maybe in terms of like location, it could change that the Nikua city will be built more towards, I don't know, flat land, and the other type more towards trees. So the variation will be only like a few 100 meters or a few yards.
That's still the same, right? Depending on which race levels a node, that node will get that. That's not static and predetermined, right? It's not like if elves all gather in a certain zone of influence, Nikoa settlement will spawn because it's predetermined. It will still be an elf settlement, right?
Yeah, and that's really interesting that you mentioned that, by the way, because every time a node levels, that's what I know, but I'm not sure about de-leveling as well, probably, the race type changes. Right? And
I think it does.
Yeah, and since Steven mentioned, the race type of nodes will determine quite a lot, different buildings, different services, not game-breaking services, but services you want to consider. the races will swap. So not everybody can just go human and elf on the server, right? Because we will lack certain bonuses.
I feel like you might be able to like de-rank a node all the way down to like 0, which will be wilderness. So you can reset the node, and say if it was a scientific node, you can reset that and then go a military node. I feel like you might be able to do that eventually.
No, they are static. They mentioned that specifically, but they mentioned it quite late, though, like a year after the Kickstarter or more.
Yeah, pretty late.
Yeah.
Yeah, even when you de-level it all the way to 0, it will still be the same type of node it was when it was level 4 or 3 or 2. It's always static.
I think they need to do this because else people will metagame stuff like having a lot of teleport nodes next to each other or stuff like that, right? Little.
Yeah, and it's also really hard to build content around it constantly.
Yeah.
Well, it finally confirmed this just this year in March with the Know Your Nodes basics article where they said, let me quote, all nodes in the world are assigned a node type that affects the node governance system, available service, narratives, etc., etc. And later on, node types are predetermined and are the same across all servers. A node's type is static and does not change based on the node's level or destruction. That's what we wrote about this year in March. So there's a pretty late change. I think we had earlier statements that said, like what you said already, it's going to change depending on if it's destroyed or not destroyed, etc.
Yeah, then Stephen got asked on some Q&A or some sort of podcast somewhere, and he said, yeah, that's a decision we made already way back. And then he kind of came back on it, but he never really just mentioned it. But yeah.
And coming back to what was mentioned about the kind of racial type for the node, I do believe that is actually determined at each kind of node level up, as far as I remember. So at level 1, it could be a Nikua. At level 2, it could be, say, an Empyrean node, for example.
Yeah, but I'm just reading this now on the node advancement as part of Wiki. It's also determined by how many players contribute to the progression of that node. For the example here, if say for example a Renkai players progressed it by 51%, then the level 2 of that node would become Renkai. But if Pyrai contributed 62% to the level 3, it would go from a level 2 Renkai to a level 3 Pyrai. And I think it's pretty interesting how the contribution of the players changes the cultural dynamics of that node.
That's really interesting, yeah. Because you can get a situation where a guild has a castle and they want a specific node time nearby, and the leader can say like, okay, guys, everybody roll your orc or something and attack this, and we do. So we know for sure that we can level it after with our orcs, and yeah, just make it. I know there will be a little cooldown time, right? You can siege it with your normal main, and then just level it with your alt. Everybody with one alt, same race.
It's going to be interesting to see in terms of the citizenship numbers though, and like extra people, because I know, yeah, like Walolo was saying that you hopefully will be able to say, our guild's going to make this into, let's say, a Pyray node, for example. But I guess the only trouble is there may be lots of other players in the area of influence that you may not necessarily know about. So, even if you plan it, it's going to be interesting to see how much of an impact they'll have on it as well. Because I know Stephen's keen for ungilded players to have as much of an influence as gilded players. So it will be interesting to see how that turns out.
Yeah, what you do have to keep in mind is with the new system they announced a little bit back, the what was it called? That the child node will contribute to the parent node.
The vassal system.
Yeah, the vassal system, exactly. Like even the progress in the vassal nodes will continue to progress the parent node if the child node is capped. So even if you want to focus on, yeah, let's all go orcs and make an orc metropolis here, you probably won't be able to pull this off because there's just so many people in this area of influence.
Yeah, right. Because they were talking about how many people on the server, minimum of 10,000 ish.
Concurrently 10,000 at one point, and a max population of 40,000.
Oh, yeah. And if you divide that by 103 nodes, that's a lot of people to cover with
Yeah.
like a guild.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how they fine tune those numbers. And personally, I'm really interested to see the citizenship numbers at each particular level of the node, just for planning and logistics on release.
Well, it's gonna be fun. It's like there are 3 massive PvP guilds that all have their own metropolis, which means there might not be an economic metropolis. So you'll have economic guilds that are forced to PvP in order to get an economic metropolis because they have to siege one. It's gonna put people out of their own playstyle, which can be a good thing. Can also scare people away.
Definitely. And I know Steven's mentioned previously a mercenary type system in the game. So it'll be interesting to see how they utilize those assets as well, or if they do.
I think he was talking about this social organizations, and I think mercenaries might be one of them. Eventually. Like this, you have a church where you can join, or you have the thievery guild, and maybe mercenary.
Okay, so we're getting a bit too far away from nodes now. There's maybe some other stuff to talk about later. But as we finish up on the nodes, are there any final thoughts that everyone would like to add on about the node system itself?
Well, where I'm thinking about is how it will look at. I don't want to use the word end game because that's not really tied into Ashes of Creation, but how it will look after months into the game after release. Like we will probably have all the way from Metropolis down to level 2 nodes, I think, which will be kept because the vessel node, the enslaving of other nodes, will only start at level 3. So that's something to consider. So every time a node is seized, we will most likely see a few hours for it to level, and then many hours for it to level more, and then it will capped. So you're looking around a day or just over a day before it will capped at 2.
Personally, one thing I'm very interested to learn more about with regards to nodes is how the nodes are going to operate underground in the kind of Tolnar type node areas, and also I suppose, the influence that the location will have for the node. So, for example, whether it's a node by a river, or whether it's a coastal node or a node on an island, to see if those locations will really give you a distinct advantage, or whether it will be purely aesthetical.
Or maybe an underground node.
Well, they've mentioned they made the underwater life really active, just like in arcades. So it won't be that far fetched to think of an underwater node, like maybe a year after release.
Yeah,
Could be a nice update.
yeah, definitely. I must admit the underwater elements of arcade really did make it unique, especially with the naval combat. But like Buttery said, I'm going off topic.
Well, underwater node is still a node.
But yeah, I think it'd be good just to really, get into the testing period of All for One, to be honest, to really see these systems brought to life. I mean, I know some of us experienced Alpha Zero, but obviously they've made a lot of progress since then, I hope.
Yeah, there was no progression in Alpha Zero. Just the node types were there up to the village, I think. Or even the city. Can't remember.
Awesome. As we wrap up, is there anything you guys would like to say about Hand of Unity, say about Ashes of Creation? 1 minute, if you want. Let's go.
Just a quick one from me. If you're thinking of playing WoW Classic or Ashes of Creation and you want a really friendly, family-orientated, semi-hardcore to hardcore community, do check us out using the links in the description.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you in the next podcast video.